Today I'm going to tell you about the ways in which J.M. Coetze and Philip Roth respond to the legacy of Gustave Flaubert. These talks aim at demonstrating how these responses to Flaubert's legacy open up a dialogue with contemporary debates on heterosexual masculinity. First, a small introduction. The literary focus on masculinity has gained much impetus from sociological studies in response to the intellectual changes of feminism. In The Making of Masculinities, Harry Broad underlines that while women have been obscured from our vision by being too much in the background, men have been obscured by being too much in the foreground. What does it mean to be much in the foreground? It means that men have constantly written about their subjectivity, but at the same time they've constantly universalized it. Critics such as Peter Schwenger and Peter Middleton have emphasized heterosexual men's difficulties to write self-consciously and self-critically about their gender. In The Inward Gaze, Middleton observed that modern men writers have reveled in masculinity without ever quite naming it. I think there is another reason for men's silence, the lack of language for such a reflection. My proposition is that Coetze and Roth respond to this lack of language for self-reflection and inquiry into masculinity by exploiting the self-reflexive forms of the novel, displaying their main protagonist practices of reading and writing. So the first part is going to be about Coetze. My starting point is Coetze's Disgrace, a novel which was published in 1999. The protagonist of Disgrace is David Lurie, a professor of literature interested in the Romantic period, who teaches at Cape Town University. Disgrace had a lot of resonance for its representation of rape. In my PhD I discussed extensively the theme and trying to track the history of gender violence that for Coetze starts from Greek mythology. But today, due to the limited time, I'm not going to focus on the topic, but I would like to address the protagonist's blindness towards his own sexual conduct. Disgrace focuses on the period of his life when Lurie is losing magnetism to women because of his age. The question of aging deserves a reflection. Sociological studies on masculinity underline that hegemonic masculine scripts in Western culture are incomplete, as they do not consider aging. And they quote, "It is as if man ceases to be real man when becoming older men, because old age is perceived as contradicting masculinity. The mere existence of hegemonic masculine scripts regarding later life seems culturally impossible. The central role that youthful energy and physicality play in the construction of hegemonic masculinity configures old age as something contradicting masculinity. Heterosexual older men are either required to live up the standards set by hegemonic masculinity model on youth or to be perceived as degendered." Returning to Disgrace, the anxiety brought into Lurie's life by his aging body pushes him to exist in anxious flurries of promiscuity, having sex with the wife of his colleagues, random tourists and prostitutes. Lurie's dissolute lifestyle as a sexual predator finds a literary correspondence in Lord Byron, the romantic poet who is at the center of his academic interest. Lurie's relationship with women do not only bring to light his anxiety for aging, but also his alienation from sexuality. Commenting on a sexual encounter with a prostitute named Soraya, he observes, "In the field of sex, his temperament, though intense, has never been passionate. Were he to choose a totem, it would be the snake. Intercourse between Soraya and himself must be, he imagines, rather like the copulation of snakes. Lengthy, absurd, but rather abstract, rather dry, even at its hottest." Lurie depicts his estrangement from both himself and Soraya in terms of animality. The representation of animality serves in Coetze's narrative to expose sexuality as an inaccessible pre-linguistic side of a human experience. In Disgrace, this estrangement is also articulated through explicit references to Flaubert's Madame Bovary, which I really found it surprising. After having sex with Soraya, Lurie quotes from Madame Bovary and observes, "He thinks of Emma Bovary coming home, sated from an afternoon of reckless fucking. So this is bliss, says Emma, marveling at herself in the mirror. So this is the bliss the poets speak of. Well, if poor ghostly Emma were ever to find her way to Cape Town, he would bring her along one Thursday afternoon to show her what bliss can be, a moderated bliss." As a reader, Lurie resembles Emma Bovary in that they both struggle to find in their sexual experiences the bliss narrated in novels and poems. After having sex with Bev, a married woman, Lurie imagines her acting like Emma Bovary after her adulteries. But Coetze's flirtation with Flaubert is not only limited to the experience Lurie and Emma share as readers. Let's focus on the following fragment. It is indeed late. On the horizon lies a last crimson glow. The moon looms overhead, smokes hang in the air. Across a strip of wasteland, from the first row of shanks, comes a hubbub of voices. If thoughts go to Emma Bovary, strutting before the mirror after her first big afternoon. I have a lover, sings Emma to herself. Well, let poor Bev Shaw go home and do some singing too. As you can see, there are explicit references to Emma and direct quotation from Madame Bovary, but what is more interesting is the relationship that Coetze establishes with Flaubert's styles, a relationship which is dual. On the one side, by using expressions such as horizon lies, crimson glows, the moon looms, Coetze seems to mimic the suggestive writing of Flaubert and his exploration of the influence of romances on Emma's imagination. On the other, the romantic landscape and exotic scenes Emma fantasizes about are replaced here by a strip of a wasteland, marking the distance of Lurie's experience from Emma's and the distance of disgrace and South Africa from the European novelistic imagination. In Madame Bovary, poetic effects express the intensity of Emma's flux of sensation and articulate the feverishness she experiences. For instance, let's read this fragment relating one of Emma's meeting with her lover Leon. Evening was closing in. The sun struck level through the branches, dazzling her eyes. Here and there, among the leaves and on the ground, little patches of light flicker, as though humming birds in the flight had shed their feathers. All around was silence. A sweet influence seems to come from the trees. She could feel her heart begin to beat again, and the blood surging through her veins like a river of milk. Far off, beyond the wood, and on the further hills, she heard a long and wordless cries, a voice that seemed to hang in the air. Silently she listened. The contrast between the silence of the outside world and the images derived from the literature of romance, such as River of Milk, directly connects to Emma's physical sensation. In commenting on her receptiveness to sensation, Leo Bersani underlines how Flaubert fills Emma's mental blankness with a rhetoric which authenticates rather than deflates her illusions. By opposition, the description of the moments when Lurie lives intense physical sensation are rather detached and present sex as a mechanic of flesh. For example, one moment stands out in recollection when she hooks a leg behind his buttocks to draw him in closer. As the tendon of her inner thighs tightens against him, he feels a surge of joy and desire. Lurie is never left to the stream of sensual and luxurious images. Lyricism does not corroborate his sensation, but informs the sense that his desire is unknowable. In a lecture dedicated to Byron, Lurie reads to his students Byron's poems Lara, and focuses on the effects that imagination has on Count Laura, and Lurie points out that the source of Laura's impulses is dark to him. Lara, this poem symbolizes Lurie's own condition, but his reading of the poem fails to create a moment of recognition. Coetze produces a meta-literary representation of readership which exposes the limits of Lurie's self-reflexivity. I suggest that the failure of intelligibility and the opacity of one's own emotion this grace brings to light should be read again in the light of Flaubert. Critics such as Stanley Cornwell and the novelist Adam Thirlwell interpret Flaubert's narrative as an examination of the constant inability of humans to introspect correctly. Drawing on this tradition, Coetze exposes Lurie's ignorance of emotion by putting on a stage his creative process. After having lost his job and being sent away by his daughter, Lurie moves to Salem, where he experiences seclusion and isolation. Here Lurie alludes to the poem So We'll Go No More a Roving, that Byron wrote inspired by the exhaustion of aging, which contemplates a pause from desire. Lurie feels like giving up passions altogether. Who would have thought it would come to an end so soon and so suddenly, the roving, the loving. This withdrawal from desire reverberates in the opera Lurie starts composing, entitled Byron and Italy, which he describes as a chamber plays about love and death, with a passionate young woman and a once passionate but now less than passionate older man. The protagonists of Lurie's opera are an aging Byron and his young lover Teresa Guiccioli. Soon, Lurie realizes that the initial project can no longer express his feeling. He starts writing a new version in which Byron is long dead, focusing on Teresa as a widow in her loneliness. The death of Byron gives Teresa the central role in the opera, and this decision is rooted in the increasingly anxious need to establish empathy with women Lurie starts feeling, and his desire to turn Byron in Italy into a meditation on love between the sexes. But as the composition of Byron in Italy advances, instead of producing an understanding of the women in his life, Lurie's creative act expresses his own sexual concern. My love, sings Teresa, swelling out the fat English monosyllable she learned in the poet's bed. A woman in love, wallowing in love, a cat on a roof howling, complex proteins whirling in the blood, distending the sexual organs, making the palms wet and voice thicken as the soul hurls its longing to the skies. That is what Soraya and the other were for, to suck the complex protein out of his blood like snake venom, leaving him clear-headed and dry. By comparing Teresa to a cat in love, Lurie emphasizes the biological aspect of sexual arousal. For establishing any empathy with the other sex, Teresa's singing addresses the opacity of Lurie's masculine desire and the alienation he experiences in sex. Byron in Italy recalls the notions of writing as a whole expressed by Coetze. Writing is not free expression. There is a true sense in which writing is dialogic, a matter of awakening the counter-voice in oneself and embarking upon speech with them. The understanding of Lurie's sexual desires that Byron in Italy shapes lies in this dialogical dimension. The interplay of Teresa's and Byron's voices becomes the centrally radiating core of the opera. That is how it must be from here on, Teresa giving voice to her lover and Byron giving voice to Teresa. Speaking out one for the other, the lovers enact their respective desire, making this dynamic into a compositional principle. The self-consciousness Lurie tries to achieve is presented as an awareness of the otherness within himself, and is reminiscent of Michael Holquist, who observed that in dialogism, consciousness is otherness. As a narrative focusing on an aging man, Disgrace displays the dissonance between older men's earlier gender habitus and the limitation of the male aging body. But to what extent the opacity of emotion Lurie's experience depends on the effect of literary mediation on masculinity. To investigate this aspect, I look now at Peter, the protagonist of Philip Roth's My Life as a Man, as exemplary of the suppression of feeling and emotional inhibition which characterize heterosexual masculinity. My Life a Man juxtaposes the autobiographical narrative of the 50-year-old writer Peter Tarpol, entitled My True Story, with his short story Courting Disaster. My True Story focuses on Peter's nightmarish marriage to Maureen Johnson. While traditionally in Western culture marriage marked the passage from youth to manhood, My Life as a Man offers an antithetical view. Peter's account goes back to 1958, when at 25 he has already published stories in literary magazine and is writing his first novel. Peter's engagement with literature defines his character. The influence of literature reverberates in Peter's fascination with complex moral issues. I was not about to settle for complexity and depth in book alone, stuffed to the gills with great fiction, entranced not by cheap romance like Madame Bovary, but by Madame Bovary. I now expected to find in everyday experience the same sense of the difficult and the deadly earnest that informs the novel I admire the most. Flaubert's presence in My Life as a Man is pervasive. Peter described his dedication to literature as a Flaubertian vocation. For him, Flaubert is the genius who formed his literary conscience as a student and as an aspiring novelist. Flaubert's journey to Egypt inspires Peter to look for a relationship that can add interest to his life, that templing a no creature of a young man's eroto-heroic imagining, an older woman. Evocative of sentimental educations, Peter's desire is satisfied when he meets the twice-divorced Maureen Johnson, a woman who embodies a world unknown to Peter's literary experience. Despite their initial attraction, Peter's desire to end his relationship with Maureen because of their constant arguments. Nevertheless, Maureen deceives Peters and forces him to marry her. The moment in which Peters accepts to marry her is revealing. It seemed then that he was making one of those moral decisions that I had heard so much about in college literary courses. Perhaps, if I had not fallen so in love with this complicated fiction of moral anguish, I would never have arrived at what seemed to me the only honorable decision for a young man as morally serious as myself. Peter's emphasis on seriousness and honor and his fascination with literature informed his masculinity as a young intellectual. The marriage exacerbates the tension between Maureen and Peter. When Peter visits his brother Moses, the stress he suffers in his marriage is expressed at a physical level. I was in the bathroom by this time. Mo, the brother, kneeled down in the tiny tiled room beside the toilet, where I was sitting on the seat, watery feces running from me, sweating and simultaneously trembling as I thought they were packed in her eyes. The somatization of his traumatic relationship with Maureen brings to light Peter's corporality. More than achieving maturity through his marriage, Peter's undergo a regression. His brothers call him by his childhood nickname and comforts him as if he were a kid while he sits on the toilet. Lost the sense of the noveling literary frames he has projected onto his own masculinity, Peter wonders, how do I ever get to be what is described in the literature as a man? Peter matures the idea of writing a fictional account of his marriage to make sense of his life and masculinity. That book, based upon my disadventure in manhood, I still of course spent maddening hours on every day, and I had some 2,000 pages of manuscript in the liquor carton to prove it. What impressed one upon attempting to penetrate that prose was not the imaginary world it depicted, but the condition of the person who had been doing the imagining. The manuscript was the message was turmoil. Peter's urge to fulfill a literary form of masculinity pervades his writing. The act of penetration is the metaphor Peter chooses to articulate self-seeking. Its failure is symbolic of man's ignorance of emotion in the manner of the failure of intelligibility of Louis Byron in Italy. Unable to complete his work, Peter's investigation of his experience is conveyed in his short story Courting Disaster, featuring his alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman, as a protagonist. In Courting Disaster, Nathan meets his future wife, Lydia, when teaching a night course in creative writing. 5 years older than him, Lydia is a divorced woman, mother of the 10-year-old Monica. Lydia's story includes childhood mysteries, her father's sexual abuses, and a violent husband. The details of Lydia's life are inspired by the different accounts Maureen tells Peter through the main plot, my true story. Through his literary alter ego, Peter ironizes on his tendency to project literary meaning onto his desire. For instance, when Nathan imagines that he and Lydia may obtain redemption through oral sex. Where Emma Bovary had read too many romances of her period, it would seem that I had read too much criticism of mine, that I was, by eating her, thinking some sort of sacrament was a most attractive idea, for one that I rejected after the initial momentary infatuation. Developing a parallel with Madame Bovary, Peter ironically acknowledges the influence of literary criticism on his life. As in Disgrace, the comparison between the male protagonist and Emma highlights their awareness that life events do not conform to narrative dynamics. Nevertheless, this realization does not emancipate Lurie and Peter from their search for narcissistic falsification of their lives. Commenting on Courting Disaster, Peter observes that his artistic experiment failed, and he should write a character inspired by Henry Miller or Céline rather than Flaubert. I won't be such an Olympian writer as it was my ambition to be back in the days when nothing called personal experience stood between me and aesthetic detachment. The notion of aesthetic detachment Peter refers to stems from Flaubert's artistic principle. Peter quotes from Flaubert's letters to Louise Colette. You wrote with a personal emotion that distorted your outlook and made it impossible to keep before your eyes the fundamental principles that must underlie any imaginative composition. You have turned art into an outlet for passion. In another letter, Roth doesn't quote, Flaubert elucidates the relationship between emotion and writing. The more personal you are, the weaker. The less you feel a thing, the fitter you are to express it as it is. Drawing on Flaubert, Peter's belief that the suppression of his emotion is necessary for literary creation. The emotional detachment finds a formal counterpart in what critics describe as Flaubert's impersonality, which means the abandonment of the first-person narration and authorial intrusion which express opinions. Stylistically, with his first-person narration, his authorial intervention addresses to the reader, Courting Disaster violates all the Flaubert's formal dictates. The greatest violation of all is Flaubert's fundamental principle. A writer must not be his own theme. Flaubert would abhor the self-referentiality of Courting Disaster. My Life as a Man exposes the prominence of Peter's experience over his textual practices. In this regard, thinking that the novel was published in 1974, My Life as a Man can be also seen as a response to the aims and methods of the Nouveau Roman, most especially to Alain Robbe-Grillet's positive conviction that the human tendency to anthropomorphize experience can be overcome. My life as a man showed that not even metafictional process can evade human experience. Peter's writing roots in the traumatic relationship with Maureen, as he ironically admits, struggling with a woman over a marriage has occupied him in that way that writing Madame Bovary had occupied Flaubert. The outcome of Peter's endeavor to write his masculinity is described as a novel in chaos, a continuous process of self-erasures and self-inscription that never comes to unities or completion. So, a couple of very quick conclusions. In this talk, I have emphasized the different inflections of Flaubert's influence on Coetze and Roth. The engagement of their novels with Flaubert's narratives opens a meta-literary space which is fulfilled by an attempt to develop a self-reflection heterosexual masculinity and its gender specificities. This attempt, insignificant in the light of the struggle of heterosexual men to conceive of their gender identity, emphasized both by sociological and literary studies. Having focused on the relationship between men's literature and emotional repertories, the model for which heterosexual men live and express, or deny, feelings, I would like to conclude quoting from Ronald de Souza, who writes that emotion themselves, wrong one. Emotion themselves act like a model and give us frameworks in terms of which we perceive, desire, act, and explain. So emotion do not only express subjectivity, but also has the capacity to criticize, to analyze, and to reconceive subjectivity. With de Souza's words in mind, I believe that the representation of creativity as an unfulfilled quest for self-discovery drawn by Coetze and Roth proves that we can rethink masculinity, and we can do it through fiction.
Thank you.
So, if you have some question to Stefano, I can start. It's interesting. Your study is about intertextuality, and it's like Roth talks about two traditions, the Flaubertian tradition and the Millerian tradition. Henry Miller's tradition.
Yes.
It's two different ways to talk about the body and sexuality. It's your PhD is about these traditions, or what is your?
Yes, my PhD, what really I didn't say. The starting idea was really trying to understand why all these writers were always talking about sexuality by referring to other authors, and in the case of Philip Roth, he brings together so many different authors. In this one, is really about Flaubert, but he's constantly depicting several models. He is this fascination for libertinism or libertinage, and that kind of idea of sexual freedom that he tries to embrace. And then he has also this idea, what he calls the Chekhovian idea of romantic love, that for him is embodies always his characters have parents who, despite being represented as the stereotype of the Jewish family, but they are always deeply in love and care about each other. So he looks at them with and that they're aging as something that really fascinates him and as an ideal to aspire. So his characters are always conflicted between these different representation of sexuality, romanticism, disillusions that may come from Chekhov, or I don't know, the sexual transgressions it can in some novels is very inspired by the Sad. So he has constantly this oscillation between different literary models, and at the same time he has this impulse, this search for a literary explanation of his sexuality kind of affects the way he reads text. So in another novel which is entitled The Professor of Desires, we have this character who starts interpreting Kafka in the light of his own sexuality. So all Kafka novels becomes about the impossibility of reaching a sexual climax. He goes to Czech Republic where he meets other intellectuals, and he decides and they always play with his fiction because he meets Czech intellectuals really fascinated by Melville, and they to ask him a question about Melville, his rage, something missing in European culture, and instead there is like Kepes, the protagonist of this novel, who's really interested like in Kafka's sexuality, and so like he has a dream where like he meets Kafka's prostitute, and so he starts asking these prostitutes like trying to learn. It's really ironic, like trying to learn like about Kafka's sexual habits, to understand like Kafka and like his masculinity, and in particular the relationship that Kafka has with marriage as an idea of again of like I don't know, like he sees at the same time as something scary as like an idea of settling down, but at the same time it emerges like as like the only way to fulfill masculinity, like becoming a father. And so like he reads, like he's constantly like creating meta literary interpretation of like his own ironic jokes, and so he reads Kafka letter of to his father as like as exemplary of Kafka resistance to the hegemonic models of masculinity. So like he's
it's the surrealist problem about, with love. We have André Breton and more local, and in the surrealist discussion about love, we have the problem of elective love or libertinist love, and that's important. It's do you think that's an opposition important in the literature of the century?
Honestly, I wouldn't be able to say like in the literature of the century. I think it is, but like trying to think about my writer, like my writers, like the writers, like I work on. Yes, it's definitely something that I see as recurrent. Like for instance, like Kundera is obsessed by what he calls like the two male archetypes, the Don Juan and the Tristan. So there is always like but for him they are not only like, he tends to apply to men because he's mostly right from a male perspective, like also in his character, but he also like inflects it through female characters. But in any case, he has this idea that like he looks for a third option between like these I don't know how to say, intoxication of feelings. Like for him, feelings are not really something I don't know, primordial. They are really social constructions. So we like is really also like what André Gide does, like constantly questioning if like we are in love, if we are in love, or we are in love with the idea of being in love, and like how like the and why this happens, like how many like as a way to give sense to our own experiences, like being in love with someone. And on the other side, there is for him like this the myth of the Don Juan, and like and again like interprets like in different ways. There is like the idea of Don Juan as a seducer, but then he sees like how this may be dangerous as well, like in the sense that it becomes like in contemporary culture as like a mechanic of desires. And like for example, in one of his novels, which is called La Lenteur, slowness in French, he starts thinking about Vivant de non point de lendemain, no tomorrows, which is like this short libertine novel, and he opposes this to La Clause de liaison dangereuse. And like and for him, like he tried to show how like even within libertinage, like because I used to think libertinage as a kind of an Italian movement, but instead there are several different currents in it, and like and so like there is like the idea of desire as like a conflict, as like where like one like person like wins, where like there is one who is seduced. And then there is like he finds in this novel by short novella, No Tomorrow, the story of like how like you can use this awareness of the mechanics of desire as a way to protect desire and pleasure. Is a kind of sort of moderate hedonism, like trying to understand that like human experience is very limited, and but we can still enjoy sexual pleasure without having it. I don't know to say, damaging other, and without like lying to ourselves about the extent of our emotions. And another writer works like with this kind of contraposition between like a kind of romanticism and libertinism. it doesn't exactly does it in a very different way, but for instance in Coetze is recurrent idea of like a Platonic love, and this character lives like a sexual desire as something that like is really uncomfortable to them. Like in my presentation I talk about animality, and like I think it's in Waiting of the Barbarian, one of his characters describe like his penis as like an animal that's attached to him. Like there is like Coetze's protagonists have sexual desires, but they don't enjoy it. For them, is a physical urge, and they constantly trying to find like they would like to live their sexual desire like in a more fulfilling way, because there is this kind of over self-consciousness about sexuality doesn't allow them to express themselves sexually, and at the same time they have this idea of a Platonic love, which is like borrow like from again this romantic tradition of Don Quixote, this Platonic idea of the women as an ideal archetype, and so like his character constantly as well oscillates between these two different oppositions. So like to my understanding, I would say I really see it as like a defining moment, and like there's a defining opposition, and even thinking in very everyday terms, like I don't know, I think everybody as a friend will say like that girl like is the perfect girlfriend, like about a date they would like to a girl they would like to date.
Yes.
Like
it's the dérangement problem.
Yes. Tristan and
Yes.
I was going to ask. So your dissertation starts with like a kind of, so it's Quixotean archetypes, and can you explain more or less like which are the influencees and which are the influencers, and like?
Oh, that's really complicated.
well, basically like which contemporary novelists do you work with mostly?
I work mostly like with kind of the text I have analyzed like really in deep details belong to Coetze, Kundera, Philip Roth, and Mario Vargas Llosa. I use Don Quixote as a frame because, as you might have seen from my presentation, there are always like this investigation into sexuality is always presented like as a relationship between like experience and literary representation. And so like, but like as an intertext, like the thesis expands a lot like through other authors. That's why to me was really complicated, like because I discovered, like while working on the novel, I discovered references I didn't notice at first. Like for example, like in Coetze's Diary of Obadiah, there is a strong influence of Ezra Pound and the way Ezra Pound engaged with troubadour literature, and so on. Again, this idea of the angelic woman, and there is so much about it. Or like so you would say that like every chapter has like these main contemporary authors, and then subsection on like more or less contemporary author. Like for Philip Roth is Kafka, Gombrowicz, Flaubert. So then I tried to bring together the novel. We're addressing the same themes from the same authors. Like for example, like in chapter 2, like I've noticed that like both Roth and Kundera were talking about the coming of age, and we were both doing it with reference to Gombrowicz. Like in the third chapter became about like Flaubert, because I noticed that like it was like recurrent in Coetze, Vargas Llosa, and Philip Roth.
Yeah, but I think when you start working with an intertextuality, sometimes it can really be like this black hole that you lose yourself, because then you start, you try to trace back intertextuality, and it's very overwhelming. Especially, for example, I work with Joyce. Like Joyce has Hamlet, has Mallarmé, has a bunch of Latin poets, and it's just, and then you start seeing, and because they also, like for example, Joyce also has a criticism on those authors and it's in the context of a character who is also a teacher. So it's like it's kind of embedded criticism that you have to like bring out, but at the same time it's a fictional character.
And in these authors' it's the same. It's not only a reference; it's a commentary.
It's a
stylistic thinking.
Yes.
And a lot of the characters are professors as well.
They are all professors or writers or intellectuals. Like it's like a typology of all of them. Like there is no one that was like
Nabokov too.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Nabokov has this wonderful lectures on literature. I don't know if you've read them, and he's one of the most amazing Joyce critics for me, because he really explains how hard it is, for example, to put in a map of a city that's so vivid in a novel like Joyce does, with cutouts of maps and newspapers and things that he found, because he wasn't living in Dublin. If he had been living in Dublin, it would have been easier, but from like being detached from the city and then recreating the city in the novel, it's really...
Mais alguma questão? Do you have some battalion commentary?
I just think this is a way of dealing with an interpretation of libertinism as toxic masculinity, probably.
That's interesting, because we're maybe Philip Roth kind of will go into direction, but for example Kundera talks about two works, libertine works, in which it picks actually one of the only texts in literature it's not really famous. I don't know how we find it out. No Tomorrow, and the story is about this young chevalier, and basically he meets this Madame de T, who is this lady who seduces him, and then he lies to him, and at the end the character, so basically she's this female character who lies to everybody, and in the end Kundera talks about this work from
what book?
It's called The Poindel and the Mant by Vivant Denon. Is not translated in English, will be No Tomorrow. Okay. And so Madame de T has this affair. She says but she has already another lover, so she lies also to her other lover, because she's married, and saying that she's going out with this chevalier to distract her husband's attention from the first lover. And so it's the only one of the few texts taken in Western tradition where a woman cheats and nothing happens to her. Is actually passes as the kind of winning personality. And at the same time he talks about and for him Madame de T becomes the character holding the secrets of pleasure, the character because he really analyzes in his own novel, analyzes the novel and the art of conversation. She doesn't just satisfy sexual desires, but through her words, through her ritual, by pretending to deny herself initially, she creates increases the intensity of the sexual encounter. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the other novel Kundera refers to, when he talks about libertinism, is Les Liaisons Dangereuses, and what's the name of the female?
It's Ligações Perigosas in Portuguese.
Yeah, but the name of
Madame Mertel.
Madame Mertel,
yeah.
And how Madame Mertel is actually kind of the, I don't know what to say, the central character in the sense of her analysis of desires, that she understands desire as a conflict to manipulate.
Yeah, she's the one pulling all the strings.
The strings. So in
she wins the game.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting how these characters are all misogynist to an extent, but they have always kind of trying, and I don't think they do intentionally, because they are so openly misogynist that it's really hard to notice these little things they do. For example, Philip Roth says that in his novel that the best writer has been able to engage with sexual pleasures and the human body is Colette. So in his novel in My Life as a Man, the character who is what he's trying to achieve, what he call this pitiless gaze on the human experience that Flaubert had, is his crazy wife. So there are always this super negative and kind of regressive presentation of masculinity, but there are always I don't know, female characters which embody a particular. Then again, it becomes a projection. It's never about femininity itself. It's the way a male character see women. But they become I don't know, kind of center of very different I don't know, projections again.
I think the main point is that toxic masculinity, as you're saying, ends up destroying desire itself. And this is a way of younger writers dealing with that destruction of desire that is imposed on them, maybe. it's a destructive desire.
Yeah, like I get it, like from thinking about in terms of Bataille, yeah. Yes, like in the there is like a lot like in actually that's like I was thinking when you told me you work on Bataille or where
Yeah.
did I use it in my PhD, and there is a part where like Philip Roth, like the protagonist in The Professor of Desire is another novel, I didn't discuss it here. The protagonist has an affair with like as a threesome literally with two Swedish girls, and like again the male character starts feeling really guilty because one of the two girls starts getting increasingly uncomfortable with what they've done, and like the only character among the three of them like who's really completely free and able to experience her sexuality is the other Swedish girl, and so like for him it becomes like this ideal of sexuality, you can live sexuality purely, and it's very interesting because when there is like one scene when it describes like when they've finished their sexual encounters, he describes the scene as like a religious sacrifice, and like he describes the bed becomes the altar, and like the body, and he says like he talks about how the body doesn't respond anymore when like the sexual desire is satisfied. So like he creates like this form of describes these forms of alienation where in which like the body is not problematic or not like something which creates alienation only in during the sexual experience. After like when the sexual experience is ended, like the body becomes problematic. So it's like there is kind of constant like conscience of the body that you can lose only through like the sexual act.
But the sacrifice is made by him, and the sacrifice is the girl who didn't enjoy.
No, I think the kind of the ritual that they consumes like is the sexual. There is no like I don't know to say a godscape here. Like, but when I was reading it, it really reminded me of Bataille's eroticism. When he has all this part like about like the sexual experiences, like the I don't know how to say it in French with my horrible pronunciation, but like le petit moire, the little death, like the little death.
Okay.
I'm sorry, couldn't really answer, but
It's okay. It's food for thought.
It's interesting that this question about the intoxicated masculinity is interesting to think about Valmont and Mertel, because she could be a frustrated woman or a free woman. It depends on the interpretation. Because Valmont falls in love, and she's totally adverse to love. Some writers about Laclos talk about the way Mertel's letters are the literary are the best in writing in intellectual complexity, and that complexity is express the complexity of Mertel's sexuality too. It's literary and sexual complexity. Do you think she is free or frustrated?
I don't honestly have like my like
these men. It's
yeah,
the same. They are frustrated.
No, like I don't know. To me,
free.
like a kind of like not positive, but of the character, but I read it really superficially. Like I wouldn't describe her like as frustrated. Like I don't know. She's like the mind in the book. Like that would be my non-educated opinion.
Yes.
But like this character, I would say instead like frustrated.
Yes.
This man is like a kind of this the crisis of white heterosexual masculinity, like a writer like Updike, you know, is it? Updike. This like I don't know. It's something like I don't think there is like a happy character. Like the only one who gives like an insight about like in this kind of is able to create like a third model between this contraposition we discuss about like between the seducer and the romantic lover is Kundera, who is always like sometimes in his novel he puts like this figure of like the man in his 40s, and is someone who learned how not to fall victim of his own emotions, and is still like is able to live sexuality in a satisfying way, because then Kundera has this very problematic understanding like of feminism and of the sexual revolution, that for him like he's in his works like he's in favor of the sexual freedom of women, but like for him this change has created like a kind of loss in eroticism, like because there is no longer the need for seduction, and so like becomes like what he say like and while writing an essay about Philip Roth, he says that women have become like I don't know, say something like women who do not need to be conquered anymore, and so there is no longer the effort, so there is no longer the seduction, like so like there is like it's not like as much as like a nostalgia for like sexual inequality. It is, when into practical term it is, but like in his reflection is like a nostalgia for like a world where like I don't know, meaning, there was meaning, like you know, the situation were like easy to interpret, like the there was this like kind of ritual, and like they were both people revolving this ritual, like I can't remember, like it's very similar like to someone else's idea, but right now I can't collect the name. So like there is like this idea of a rituality, which was like in for him improving sexual experience, which is lost, and sometimes in his character like he casts like a female character who are seducers, like in I think in the Unbearable Lightness of the Being, like this real seducer is Salina, I can't remember, like so it's not something exclusively male, but obviously like when you think about the Western society, like it was like definitely like something patriarchal.
I was gonna ask. I was thinking that don't you think these characters are more fascinated and more I would say more excited about the male archetypes that they want to follow and to copy than necessarily about the sexual experiences with the women. Like it's kind of like a bromance with the past,
Yes.
you know, with the authors of the past, and that's, you know,
Yes.
really it's more of a platonic love for the creators of this idea of masculinity than for the
Yes.
sexual need or attraction or the pleasure that they will get from their experiences with women.
Totally, like in and Coetze's Disgrace is really about that, like because like this Byron in Italy, it starts like as a meditation on the love and the sexes. Like all the second part of the novel is about him trying to establish a connection with his daughter, like the one who is raped in the novel. Like so, like it's really like he wants to talk about this, like with her, like he's genuinely trying. But like you see that he's completely unable to focus on anything else, like except but himself. And like Byron in Italy so becomes this story, like, and even when like Byron, the character, like the alter ego is eliminated, and you have like Teresa Guiccioli, he's like Guiccioli, Teresa is giving voice to Byron to lure his own request, and it's really like the novel like is something I didn't get the first time I was reading, but it's a very heavy novel, but at the same time it's very like funny, and moments of irony towards the male character, because like he's not in control of his writing, so like sometimes there is like actually something true to that Byron and the daughter Allegra, and like so like in his writing like the character of Allegra pops out and starts like using the voice of Lurie's own daughter, and like about the fact that he was ignoring her. There is like a very funny conversation when like he says like the daughter says like I'm not a secondary character in your novel, and like and all the characters point out like there is a constant parallel between like his ambition to be a seducer with Don Quixote's desire to be a knight, which is completely delusional.
Because in Don Quixote it's delusional, so then
Yes.
it's like another layer of
And like but there is Andre Brink, like this character we're talking about, and like he takes Don Quixote as an example of the way like men project meaning on women, because like he falls in love with Dulcinea, but Dulcinea is like a peasant, for him become a princess, and it doesn't matter what Dulcinea was, like the important thing is what he makes of her. And at the same time, like with the woman he fall in love with, student with him, he has an affair which like which turned out like to be rape. Like for him, like he was like at the moment like that's really interesting, because like he's really fascinated by her, by her sexuality as something inexpressed, full potential, like he imagines her like becoming a seducer, but then in certain moments he describes her as the perfect prey.
Yeah, but I think it's
The ideal prey.
very current, because it's about this idea of professors having
Yes.
sex with students who are adults, so I mean, and they can consent, but at the same time there's always
The novel is more ambiguous than that, like
no, of course, but I'm kind of there's
No.
also this relation of power, you know, that and that you don't really I mean, the first time I read Disgrace, I didn't really understand, you know, I didn't really understand where the power was, even though, you know, naturally the power would be in the professor, who is, you know, the authority figure supposedly, but
I think like it's not very clear, but kind of like the novel points to the fact that he's using his power,
Yeah.
like to sleep with her, like, and that like what I think is really great, because like even as a man, when you think about like to write about rape, or trying to write about like a male and female relationship, what is really good about and problematic, but is like I think is like kind of a brave choice, like the fact that like you never hear the voice of the victim in the novel. She's the character who doesn't speak, and the one who reports like the I don't know, I think we said the Lurie's illicit conduct
Yeah.
is her boyfriend.
Yeah.
So like, and she doesn't go to the kind of little like university trial they have. So like you never hear her voice in the novel, and like there is this ellipsis, and like in the same way like his daughter never talks about the rape, and there is no description of the rape, like you only see the Lurie's point of view when he's like locked in a lavatory when this happens.
yeah, then again, it's like that part's I didn't remember that part about the boyfriend, but yeah, it's like two men fighting over, like I'm defending this woman, she's my, you know, and the other one's like, it's like kind of just it's between men again. It's a combat between.
And
men.
there's always like Lurie's trying to be.
And they're both like removing the voice of the woman. Yeah.
There is the part when he says, when you say like bromance with the past,
Yeah.
when he says like, oh, no one would have called for thinking about Byron. And another interesting thing is about Lord Byron, that like, I don't know, he never questioned Byron's sexuality, he's always presents as like as a heterosexual seducer. Byron was a bit more complex than
Yeah,
that.
he
like,
was polyamorous, you can
Polyamorous.
say.
but say like the way like no one would have like called rapes like when he was forcing himself in a waitress's bed. And there is like no one would have called that rape. Yeah, as an argument, like you can logically take it, but it was a bit different time, and we live in a different era right now.
Maybe someone
like-
would like slit his throat like the
That's
that
what
girl's
that's actually
brother or something, right?
and that's what he says exactly. But none of them would have feared like to get their throat slit.
Yeah. So the physical consequences of rape. I mean,
It's like a very controversial
and when
text.
people took justice into their own hands, you know, and it's like different.
Yeah, but it was like for the bromance with the past that he always trying to be like a Byron,
Yeah.
and that's really pathetic. Like
Yeah.
It's like, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.